chapter 50, verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them.
Good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning. If you're visiting with us, we're especially glad to have you, and we hope that our service today will be uplifting you and, more importantly, will draw you closer to God. My name is Quinn Britt. I'm not the regular pulpit minister here, thank goodness. But I am one of the men in the congregation who will be speaking over the next several weeks as we go through this story. And I thought it might be helpful to give you some insight or perspective on me by sharing my perspective. Now, many of you may know that I'm not from here. You may can tell that from the way I speak, but I'm not from here. So if you're from the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast, you may have a perception of Tennessee. This is my perspective on the state of Tennessee. Some of the icons, some of the more notable features of that state, which is where I'm originally from. Now, if you've not been to Tennessee, or maybe if you have, maybe this is your perception of Tennessee. And no, that's not a family portrait. But many of you may know that I didn't come here directly from Tennessee. I came here via Texas, and on the screen you can see some iconic images from the state of Texas. Once again, if you're not from the state of Texas and you've never been there, or again, perhaps if you have, maybe this is your perception of the state of Texas. Perspective matters. We're embarked on a study called The Story, and it's just a way to approach the Bible in a different way that tells it as one continuous story. And the Bible is one continuous story. It's about God, it's about man, it's about what went wrong, and it's about what God has done and is doing to make things right. And it's important as we approach the Bible that we do it understanding that God's perspective, much like our perspectives may be different, God's perspective and our perspective are different. Quick illustration of that point. There was once a young man who was considering his life and where he was, considering what his role in creation might be. So he drove off to a lonely place at night where it was very secluded and very dark. He got out of the car and laid on the hood of his car and just put his hands behind his head and looked up at the sky. And he noticed all the stars. And if you've ever been into a remote location, just it's incredible the number of stars. And he's looking up there and he's weighing the vastness of the universe and God's intention in his life. And he goes, wow. And suddenly God speaks to him and he says, "What do you think?" He says, "Man, that's impressive. There must be a billion stars up there." "What's a billion to you, God? What are a billion stars to you?" And he goes, "Well, it's like a light bulb to me." And thinking of the vastness of the universe, he said, "What's a billion light years to you?" To get across it, we understand it's so far, it takes light years. "What are a billion light years to you?" And he goes, "A billion light years are just a minute to me." And all this talk of billions brought him to the topic of budgets. And he goes, well, God, what's $1 billion to you? He said, $1 billion is like a penny. He thought for a second. He said, "God, can you spare a penny?" And God said, "Sure, just wait a minute." Perspectives matter. God's perspective is the upper story of the Bible. It's the broad view. It's his overarching plan for his creation. The lower story are the individual stories of the people and places and events that happen along the way. And we're going to talk about one of those lower stories today that certainly has a very dominant upper story message, and that's the story of Joseph, a young man who goes from being in a pit and sold as a slave to becoming the second most powerful person in Egypt. We are going to race through the story of Joseph. If you have not read it recently, you should read it. If you've never read it, you should read it. It's one of those stories in the Bible that's a page turner. And let's face it, there aren't a lot of page turner stories in the Bible. Some of them are hard to understand. This one is not. This is a great story. Joseph is the favored son of his father. He was born to his father in his old age, and he was the son of his favorite wife, Rachel. Jacob gives Joseph a garment that signifies this favoritism. In some places it's called a coat of many colors, some places it's a coat with unique sleeves. There are other descriptions, but what it did is it physically symbolized his favoritism. So he wore this coat around that symbolizes favoritism. Now he's only 17 and he's the youngest of 11 brothers in a culture that doesn't normally recognize the youngest brother. In addition to that, he occasionally snitches on his brothers, and we're told in the very beginning of the story that he's been out with them keeping sheep, and he tells a bad report on them. And because of between the favoritism and this snitching, this tattling, if you will, his brothers hate him. Jacob has two dreams. The two dreams, one involves tares of wheat, the other involves the sun, the moon, and the stars. But the point of these dreams is that he sees his brothers and his family eventually bowing down to him. And whether it's through naivete or whether it's through arrogance or whether it's through, I got to tell this story, he tells his brothers that and they hate him even more. The fact that he thinks that someday they will bow down to him. One day when the brothers are far away from home keeping sheep, Dad sends him off to go check on them, almost as if his personal spy. Go check on what they're doing and come back and tell me. So he goes off, and as the brothers see him approaching, they think, you know what, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. We're miles from home. We're going to take care of this problem once and for all. And they plot to kill him. Now Reuben, the oldest brother, intervenes and says, hey, let's not kill him, put him in the pit. And Reuben intends to come back and save him later. While Reuben is away, though, apparently he is stripped of his coat, he's thrown into that pit. And then Judah, who's the fourth oldest, comes up with a new plan. He sees these traders coming along, and he says, hey, let's sell him. So he's sold for 20 pieces of silver, about the price of an average male slave. And then they plan a cover-up story. Well, Joseph obviously has got to be distraught about this. His brothers are not bowing down to him. Things are not going his way. And his coat has been stripped from him. It's not anything like that dream he had. Reuben, when he learns that they've sold Joseph, he's distraught as well because he says, what have you done? And then when they go and tell Jacob that his son is no more, Jacob is distraught. He says he could not be consoled. He would not forget Joseph for the rest of his life. Joseph is taken to Egypt where he's sold again, this time as a slave to Potiphar's household, who's a leading citizen in the kingdom. He's the captain of the palace guard. And in this role of slave, Joseph becomes very successful. Matter of fact, he becomes the overseer of Potiphar's entire household. And because of that, Potiphar's house is blessed. Apparently, Joseph is a fine specimen of a young man. And Mrs. Potiphar, Potiphar's wife, becomes the original desperate housewife. She has her intentions set on Joseph, but he refuses her ongoing seductions because, number one, it'd be a sin against his master. Number two, and more importantly, it'd be a sin against his God. He hasn't forgotten God even though he's in slavery. Joseph is literally assaulted by her, but he escapes, leaving behind his outer cloak, which Mrs. Potiphar uses to then accuse him of the crime of assault. Now, the old saying, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, certainly has some meaning in this verse, right? She was going to take vengeance upon him. Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison, but even there he succeeds. He impresses the warden. He assumes a position of leadership and authority. Joseph meets the former cupbearer of the king and the baker of the king, perhaps because of some assassination attempt. If you think food and drink, probably they're in prison because someone made an attempt on the life of the king. Perhaps, the Bible doesn't say. But they both have dreams, and Joseph is able to interpret those dreams for them, but he gives credit to God for the ability to interpret their dreams. It's good news for the cupbearer, bad news for the baker. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he gets out of prison. I've been unjustly sold into slavery, and I've been falsely in prison. When you get out of here, you're going to be in a position to do something for me. Please help me out. The dreams that he interprets come true. The cupbearer returns to his job. The baker is executed. But the cupbearer forgets about Joseph, and so he languishes in prison. Now, Joseph's got to be thinking, why is this happening to me? I just did what my father said, and I end up sold into slavery. I honor my master and my God by not giving in to Miss Potiphar, and yet I'm accused and thrown into prison. And here God has given him this ability to interpret the dreams, and yet he's forgotten by this person whose life he was instrumental part of helping to save. Now, this is completely unfair, and there's no indication in Scripture that this is any kind of divine punishment for what he's done. As it comes to pass, the king, Pharaoh, has a couple of dreams as well. And these confound his court. One involves some cows and one involves some ears of grain. And no one can help him interpret the dream. And then all of a sudden, years later, the cupbearer says, hey, you know what? I remember this guy in prison. And he goes to the king and says, hey, this guy told me and the baker about our dreams. He interpreted them, and exactly what he said came true. And because of that, Joseph is quickly brought before Pharaoh. The king tells him his dream, and Joseph interprets those dreams. Again, giving credit to God for the ability to tell him what that dream meant. And Joseph suggests a plan of action. He says a leader is needed to help the country prepare for this famine. Well, the king sees this guy who not only can interpret his dream, but also suggests a plan of action and says, hey, I think we have the guy. That's a good idea. You're the guy. And so Joseph goes from being a prisoner in the morning to being second in command in Egypt in the space of a day. He basically wakes up in prison and goes to bed in a palace. Probably not on his day planner for the day. Meanwhile, Joseph's family, Jacob, are suffering from the famine in Canaan. And so Jacob sends his 10 sons to Egypt and says, go buy us some food. But he keeps behind the new youngest son, Benjamin, perhaps because now he's the favorite, because he's also the son of Jacob's favorite wife. The brothers go to Egypt and they appear before this governor. Joseph recognizes them. If you think about the pictures we see of Egyptians with the makeup, the unique hairstyling, they don't recognize him. They have no idea who he is. And the brothers bow down to him. And he notices this and he goes, you know what? My dream just came true. But Joseph knows the last time that he saw his brothers, they were a bunch of scallions, rapscallions, right? They were not a bunch of nice guys. So he designed some tests to determine their character and also to determine whether they have any regret for what they've done. He keeps his identity a secret, but he also in this process discovers how they remember him or how they think about him. They say, we're 12 brothers. We were 12 brothers. Our youngest is with our dad, and our one is no more. Now, I wonder why they didn't just say, we're 11 brothers. If Joseph's gone, why don't you just say you're 11 brothers? But they still mention Joseph. Is it because of their regret, their guilt, that they couldn't forget him? Joseph accuses them of being spies and insists that they bring their younger brother to him to prove that their story is true. He keeps one of the brothers as a hostage. And Jacob reluctantly allows Benjamin to go back with him to Egypt. And what's interesting here is Judah, the one who had suggested they sell Joseph, says, hey, I'll take care of him. You can trust me to take care of him. When they arrive, Joseph favors Benjamin. He prepares a meal and he gives Benjamin more food than he gives anyone else. Perhaps to test the brothers in how they deal with a new favorite youngest son. And then he has a plan to take Benjamin away from them, again, to test their character. It involves putting a cup in some grain and going off and arresting and bringing him back. And this time the brothers stand united. They don't let the youngest brother go away. They won't give up on him. They all come back, and this time Judah does what's right. In Genesis 44 it says, Judah tells Joseph, I gave my father a guarantee that the young boy would be safe. I said to my father, if I don't bring him back to you, you can blame me all of my life. So now, please allow me to stay here and be your slave, and let the young boy go back to home with his brothers. I cannot go back to my father if the boy is not with me. I couldn't stand to see him so sad. Well, Judah's conversion moves Joseph deeply, and he finally reveals himself, and he says, I'm Joseph. Don't be angry with yourselves. God sent me here, and it was for a reason. It was to preserve life. Basically, to save the family. The family moves to Egypt, and later Jacob dies. And it was not uncommon in this time that when the father died, the brothers might take revenge, because they would wait until the father died so they wouldn't disappoint him or cause him more grief. But the father dies, says, I'm going to get my revenge. So the brothers are fearful now that Joseph, the second most powerful person in Egypt, can then take his revenge against them, and they're afraid. When Joseph finds out about it, he says, don't be afraid. Can I do what only God can do? You meant to hurt me, but God turned your evil into good to save the lives of many people, which is being done. So don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. So Joseph comforted his brothers and spoke kind words to them. So in summary, in spite of all that had happened to him over the last 22 years, Joseph is able to forgive his brothers and embrace them with open arms. I don't know that I could have done that. I think there are many lessons in this story. There's hundreds of lessons in this story. I'd like to focus on 3 today. The first is that bad things happen to good people, but God is still with us. If we look at the life of Joseph, obviously it's a series of ups and downs. He goes from being the favored son to being in a pit after barely scraping by with his life. Because he's in the pit, he being sold as a slave. He now becomes the favored slave in the household. But because he's the favored slave and he has so much presence in the household, he then is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and ends up in prison again. When he's in prison, he becomes the model prisoner and becomes in charge of the prison. He interprets the dream of his fellow prisoners, but unfortunately is forgotten and languishes longer in prison. But when the cupbearer remembers, he then is brought before Pharaoh and then becomes Pharaoh's favorite again. Throughout all this, we understand that God is with Joseph. Keep in mind, this was not something that happened just over a few months, few days, weeks, or months. This happened over 13 years. Joseph was 17 years old when this story started. He's 30 by the time he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. How do we know God was with Joseph? Several ways. First, I think he was with Joseph in the heart of Reuben. The brothers were ready to kill Joseph. They were going to do it. They had the plan. And Reuben intercedes and says, let's not kill him. Don't spill any blood. Throw him into this well here in the desert, but don't hurt him. Reuben planned to save Joseph later and send him back to his father. But we're also told that specifically that God was with Joseph when he was a slave. Now, if you've just been sold into slavery, that's probably not the time you're thinking, hey, God's with me. But we're told in Genesis 39, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in his house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he didn't concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. We can see that God was with Joseph. Again, the scripture tells us this in verse 21 of chapter 39. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness and caused the prison warden to like Joseph. The prison warden chose Joseph to take care of all the prisoners, and he was responsible for whatever was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and made him successful in everything that he did. We also see that God was with Joseph when he was interpreting the dreams before Pharaoh. Even Pharaoh noticed. The king asked him, can we find a better man than Joseph to take this job? God's spirit is truly in him. So the king said to Joseph, God has shown you all this. There's no one as wise and understanding as you are, so I will put you in charge of my palace. All the people will obey your orders, and only I will be greater than you. Joseph's life, a series of ups and downs, but God was with Joseph through it all. The second lesson I think we can take from this is that we are not God. We are not entitled to revenge. If there was anyone probably entitled to revenge in the Bible, it was Joseph. But we are not entitled to revenge. Joseph shows graciousness in the way he responds to his brothers in several ways. I think the first is in the way he responds when he says, go tell Dad, after he's revealed himself. He doesn't say, go back and tell Dad all the stuff you did. Go explain to Dad while Joseph's still alive, when that's not quite the story you presented to him a few years back. No, he says, come close to me. When the brothers came close to me, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold as a slave. Now don't be worried or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. God sent me here ahead of you to save people's lives. No food has grown in the land for 2 years now, and there will be 5 more years. Oh, what have I done? There we go. Without planting or harvest. So God sent me here ahead of you to make sure that you have some descendants left on this earth and to keep you alive in an amazing way. So it is not you who sent me here, but God. God has made me the highest officer of the king of Egypt. I am in charge of his palace, and I am the master of all the land of Egypt. So he tells him, so leave quickly and go tell my father, and go to my father. Tell him, your son Joseph says, God has made me the master over all Egypt. Come down to me quickly. He realizes they're not the ones who made it happen. So he's not mad with them. He realizes they're not the one that made it happen, so he doesn't insist that they go and confess their sins to Jacob. He just says, hey, go give Dad the good news. Joseph is also gracious when he could have taken revenge and how he accepts his brothers. He says, come live in the land of Goshen, where you will be near me. Your children, your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that you have will also be near me. I will care for you during the next 5 years of hunger so that you and your family and all that you have will not starve. And last, we see Joseph's graciousness and realization that he's not God in the way that he specifically interacts with his brothers at the time after Jacob has passed. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong things we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left us these instructions before he died, which is probably a lie. Joseph's had some time with Jacob. Jacob didn't say any of this to Joseph. This is probably not true, which is not unexpected from these guys, right? This is what you are to say to Joseph. Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of the God of your father. And when this message came to him, Joseph wept. Joseph cries a lot in this story, actually. His brothers then came to him and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. Again, his dream comes true. But Joseph says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Now, perhaps his response was based on his theology. In the book we call Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 35, God speaking says, it's mine to avenge, I will repay. And it's clear as you read the story of Joseph is he doesn't forget the God of his father, even though he's in this land that doesn't worship that same God. And finally, God, he is gracious when he clearly could have taken revenge. And he said, so don't be afraid. I'm not going to take revenge. Instead, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to take care of you and your children. So he comforted his brothers and spoke kind words to them. The last lesson, and I think in some ways this is the most important, it certainly is the one that I need to keep in mind most often, and that is that God works in spite of evil to accomplish his will. God works in spite of evil to accomplish his will. Joseph certainly had a perspective that God is in control. We see this again, reiterate some of these same verses. Now don't be worried or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. God sent me here. to save lives. So God sent me here ahead of you to make sure that you have some descendants left on earth and to keep you alive in an amazing way. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. God has made me the highest officer of the king of Egypt. Now, he doesn't forget the evil that's been done to him. He doesn't minimize the evil that's been done to him by any stretch. He says, you meant to hurt me, but God has turned your evil into good to save the lives of many people, which is being done. The New International Version says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. The New American Standard says, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Joseph had a way of seeing through things that many of us, I certainly don't. When I'm in the midst of struggles, I don't see. But if you look back at Joseph's life, if he was not the favored son, he wouldn't have been hated